He called it the biggest trade deal in American history. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and Donald Trump stood proudly on the White House lawn, grinning from ear to ear. $550 billion straight from Japan, he declared, soaking in the applause. To his supporters, it looked like proof that his hardball tariffs worked. But what followed was nothing short of a political earthquake. Because only weeks later, Japan, America's closest ally in Asia, publicly tore up the deal on live television. Their new prime minister didn't just walk away, she called Trump's framework a threat to Japan's national interest. The $550 billion investment that Trump bragged about never arrived. Markets plunged, Washington fumed, and across Asia something began to shift. For decades, America dictated the rules. But this time, Asia wasn't bowing. From Tokyo to Seoul, leaders began saying no to U.S. pressure. This wasn't just another diplomatic spat, it was a declaration of independence. A warning shot that the Pacific's balance of power had changed forever. Welcome to Cross-Border News. Today, we uncover the inside story of how Japan's quiet rebellion shattered Washington's illusion of control, and how it may mark the dawn of a new Asian century. It began with spectacle, the kind only Donald Trump could stage. The White House South Lawn transformed into a celebration of power, cameras flashing as the former U.S. president stood beside executives from automakers, energy giants, and defense contractors. This, he declared, is the biggest trade deal in the history of the United States. The number was staggering, $550 billion in Japanese investment. Trump said Japan would pour those funds into U.S. industries ranging from shipbuilding and semiconductors to liquefied natural gas. Tariffs on Japanese goods would fall from 25% to 15%, while American profits would stay home. To his audience, it sounded like a masterstroke. But behind the triumphant optics, the cracks were already showing. Economists in Tokyo warned that the framework Trump touted wasn't a treaty, it wasn't even legally binding. It was a handshake deal, open to interpretation and entirely dependent on political goodwill. Japan's negotiators had signed it under intense pressure. The U.S. had threatened new auto tariffs that could devastate Japan's export economy, and Tokyo's then Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba believed compromise was the only option. In Washington, the celebration masked a harsher reality. The deal wasn't a partnership, it was leverage. The U.S. would control how Japan's funds were spent, where they were directed, and who benefited. Trump's message was simple. Invest in America or face economic punishment. For a moment, it looked like the gamble had paid off. Wall Street cheered, American factories promised thousands of new jobs, and media headlines praised Trump's art of the deal. But in Tokyo, resentment was brewing. Behind closed doors, Japan's leaders called it what it truly was, a humiliation disguised as cooperation. And soon, that humiliation would explode into open defiance. Only weeks after Trump's so-called historic victory, the illusion crumbled. Cameras once again flashed, but this time not in Washington. In Tokyo, Japan's newly elected Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi stood before her parliament and did the unthinkable. With a calm, steady voice, she tore up Trump's $550 billion deal live on national television. Her words echoed through Asia like thunder, "No agreement that endangers Japan's sovereignty will stand." In that single moment, everything changed. The photo op that Trump had crafted to showcase dominance became a symbol of U.S. overreach. Within hours, Japan's finance ministry announced it would withhold every dollar until Washington surrendered control over how the funds were used. Wall Street panicked, the yen tumbled, and the White House erupted in anger. What began as an economic disagreement quickly transformed into a geopolitical reckoning. Tokyo's defiance wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. For decades, Japan had been America's most obedient ally, often forced to follow Washington's economic and defense agenda. But under Takaichi, that era was over. Reuters reported that Japan's central bank and development agencies were already rerouting the pledged funds into domestic infrastructure and clean energy projects, bypassing Washington entirely. It wasn't rebellion, it was self-preservation. Across Asia, governments took note. What Japan had just done wasn't merely a rejection of Trump's deal, it was a declaration of independence from U.S. economic coercion. And in that declaration, the rest of Asia saw something powerful, proof that America could be challenged and beaten at its own game. But for Washington, the humiliation was personal. Trump had built his political identity on the illusion of control. Now, one ally had shattered it in full public view. To understand Japan's defiance, you have to look back at the man who came before Sanae Takaichi, Shigeru Ishiba, the prime minister who signed Trump's $550 billion framework. He had spent months cornered by U.S. tariff threats that choked Japan's car exports and unsettled its markets. Every negotiation ended the same way. Washington demanding more, Tokyo conceding just to keep the peace. By the time the deal was announced, Ishiba's approval ratings had plummeted below 20%. The Japanese public saw him not as a leader, but as the man who let America dictate Japan's economy. So when Ishiba resigned, Japan was desperate for a leader who would restore national pride. That's where Sanae Takaichi entered, the country's first female prime minister, shaped by the conservative vision of her late mentor Shinzo Abe. She campaigned on one promise: never again will Japan surrender its sovereignty for anyone's approval. Her words resonated with a nation tired of being treated as a pawn in Washington's trade games. Within days of taking office, Takaichi made her move. She froze all U.S.-related payments, declared the Trump Accord void of transparency, and redirected the funds through the Japan Bank for International Cooperation (JBIC), ensuring Tokyo, not Washington, controlled every yen. Inside the ruling Liberal Democratic Party, lawmakers erupted in applause. For the first time in decades, Japan wasn't bowing, it was standing tall. Her decision was more than a political maneuver, it was a cultural reset. A nation long defined by post-war obedience had rediscovered its voice. The message to America was unmistakable: partnership could only exist between equals. But as Takaichi's star rose in Tokyo, Washington's anger was reaching a boiling point. And the next response from the U.S. would test just how far Japan was willing to go. In Washington, disbelief quickly turned to fury. What was supposed to be a show of global leadership had become a public embarrassment. Trump's Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, the architect behind the $550 billion framework, stepped before reporters and tried to sound confident. The United States expects all partners to fulfill their commitments, he declared. But behind the polished statements, chaos was spreading through the administration. Treasury officials privately admitted Japan's move had blindsided them. Tokyo wasn't just delaying payments, it was taking full control of the funds through a domestic investment bank. That meant zero American oversight, no guarantee of U.S. job creation, and no way for Washington to claim victory. Wall Street took notice. Shares of major defense and infrastructure companies, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and Bechtel, fell sharply, erasing billions in market value overnight. The Financial Times called it a quiet revolt. For the first time in modern history, Japan had openly defied the United States, and the markets sided with Tokyo. Investors realized that Japan's decision wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. By keeping control in Tokyo, Prime Minister Takaichi had shielded her nation from another cycle of American economic dependence. Inside the White House, tempers flared. Trump's inner circle blamed foreign policy advisors, trade negotiators, and even the Pentagon for failing to keep Japan in line. Behind closed doors, aides described scenes of shouting and slammed doors as Trump demanded immediate retaliation. But retaliation against Japan, a key ally against China, risked detonating Washington's entire Indo-Pacific strategy. This was no longer about economics, it was about control slipping away. The illusion of American dominance in Asia had been shattered, and no amount of rhetoric could glue it back together. But Tokyo's rebellion was only the beginning, because just as Washington scrambled for answers, another ally decided to join Japan's side. Just days after Japan's shock announcement, another domino fell, this time in Seoul. South Korea, one of Washington's most vital allies, had quietly signed its own massive framework deal with Trump's administration earlier that year. A $350 billion investment pledge in exchange for tariff relief on key exports like cars, steel, and electronics. The deal was supposed to mirror Japan's and serve as proof that Asia was on board with Trump's economic vision. But after watching Tokyo break free, Seoul's tone changed overnight. South Korea's national security advisor stunned reporters when he declared, "We are not able to pay $350 billion in cash." His words echoed Japan's defiance almost word for word. Behind the scenes, South Korean officials revealed that Washington had demanded upfront payments, billions to be wired directly into U.S. accounts before any trade relief took effect. It was a deal designed to look generous but function as economic blackmail. Emboldened by Japan's stance, Seoul refused to play along. Instead, it began renegotiating its own trade routes, deepening partnerships with Australia, Canada, and ASEAN nations. Within days, analysts across Asia were calling it a regional rebellion. One by one, U.S. allies were peeling away from Washington's orbit, no longer willing to bankroll America's domestic agenda. Even U.S. media outlets couldn't ignore the symbolism. Bloomberg described it as the first coordinated act of economic independence by America's Pacific allies. For the White House, the optics were devastating. Trump's self-proclaimed biggest trade victory was now collapsing in real time, and the world was watching. From Tokyo to Seoul, one truth had become undeniable: Asia was no longer following orders. The empire of tariffs and threats that Washington had built was beginning to crumble. But Japan wasn't done yet. Its next move would permanently redefine its place in global power politics. What followed in Tokyo wasn't just damage control, it was a national transformation. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi had taken a gamble by tearing up Trump's deal, but instead of chaos, she found support surging at home. Across Japan, citizens saw her not as a rebel, but as a restorer of pride. Business leaders, lawmakers, and even veteran diplomats rallied behind a shared vision. Japan would no longer be a junior partner, it would be an equal power. Takaichi's strategy was deeply influenced by her mentor, Shinzo Abe, who had long championed a more assertive Japan, strong in defense, independent in trade, and unapologetically sovereign. Drawing from his legacy, she launched what Japanese media called a conservative reset. The focus was clear: maintain the U.S. alliance for security but break free from economic dependence. Corporate Japan quickly aligned. Figures like Takeshi Nanami, CEO of Suntory and head of the Keizai Doyukai Business Federation, publicly supported Takaichi's decision. He warned that Trump's deal lacked transparency, risked draining domestic investment, and could worsen Japan's already 260% debt-to-GDP ratio. His remarks, once unthinkable from Japan's business elite, signaled a profound shift in national sentiment. Tokyo also began quietly coordinating with allies across Asia to build parallel investment networks independent of U.S. oversight. Through the Japan Bank for International Cooperation, JBIC, billions were redirected toward renewable energy, semiconductor manufacturing, and maritime infrastructure, all projects previously earmarked for American contractors. To the world, it looked like defiance. To Japan, it was rebalancing, a calculated assertion that partnership doesn't mean submission. For decades, Japan's diplomacy had been cautious, its policies reactive. But under Takaichi, Tokyo was finally setting the agenda. The post-war hierarchy was collapsing, and a new one driven by Japan's own terms was taking shape. But as Japan stood taller, Washington's patience was running out, and retaliation was inevitable. In Washington, humiliation turned into retaliation. Trump's inner circle was determined to reassert control and prove that the United States still dictated the global economic order. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick unveiled a new plan, a federal investment accelerator that would determine exactly how allied funds were spent inside America. The rules were unapologetically one-sided. Allied nations would have only 45 days to respond to Washington's investment directives and no voting power over project approvals. It was meant to intimidate Tokyo and Seoul into compliance. Instead, it backfired spectacularly. Japan's finance ministry dismissed the framework as unacceptable, warning that Tokyo alone would control how and when any yen left its borders. Markets immediately reacted. The yen strengthened, signaling investor confidence in Japan's autonomy, while shares in major U.S. defense contractors continued to slide. Across the Pacific, editorial headlines captured the mood. Asia says no, economic colonialism rejected, the end of Washington's monopoly. Even American manufacturers began voicing frustration. The very companies Trump had promised to protect, auto firms, energy suppliers, and shipbuilders, were now warning that tariffs and coercion were destroying their customer base abroad. Bloomberg called it a revolt against coercive capitalism. CNN described it as America's allies rebelling against the bully economy. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, Takaichi remained unmoved. Japan values partnership, she said calmly at a press conference, but partnership cannot exist without respect. Her approval ratings soared past 60%. In Seoul, similar numbers followed. For the first time in decades, America's influence in Asia wasn't feared, it was ignored. But the story wasn't over. Because Japan's next decision, a quiet, calculated diplomatic strike, would turn Washington's frustration into full-blown panic and signal the dawn of something far bigger. By October, the standoff had evolved into something far larger than a trade dispute. It had become a symbol of shifting global power. When Japan abruptly canceled a high-level trade delegation to Washington, citing errors in U.S. tariff implementation, the message couldn't have been clearer. The era of quiet compliance was over. Diplomats in D.C. were stunned. For the first time since World War II, Japan had openly humiliated an American president on the global stage, and the world was watching. Across Asia, headlines called it a turning point. The Wall Street Journal reported that Trump's tariff diplomacy may have achieved what Beijing never could, pushing allies away. Even the Financial Times described Japan's withdrawal as a tectonic shift in the Pacific balance. In capitals from Seoul to Jakarta, leaders saw Tokyo's defiance as proof that Washington's threats had lost their bite. Inside Japan, Takaichi's strategy began to pay off. The country's currency stabilized, domestic industries flourished, and confidence surged. Tokyo's vision of a sovereign Asia, an interconnected region trading freely without U.S. mediation, was quietly becoming reality. And the irony, while Trump had tried to isolate China, his tactics ended up isolating America. Behind closed doors, even American allies began questioning the cost of loyalty. Could the U.S. still be trusted to honor its deals? Or was Washington now the world's most unpredictable partner? Analysts at Nomura Securities summed it up best. America's leverage in Asia is no longer economic, it's nostalgic. As the yen wobbled and markets adjusted to a new order, one truth became undeniable. The century of U.S. dominance was fading, and a new power map was being drawn, one defined not by fear or force but by independence. Japan had just lit the fuse, Asia would handle the rest. When Donald Trump first stood on the White House lawn declaring his biggest trade deal ever, few could have imagined how quickly it would collapse, or how completely it would rewrite the balance of power in Asia. What was meant to be a victory parade for Washington became a global lesson in overreach. The $550 billion headline that once symbolized dominance ended up exposing the fragility of America's control. Japan's defiance wasn't just political theater, it was a statement of sovereignty decades in the making. By refusing to surrender economic control, Tokyo didn't just protect its finances. It reignited a long-dormant sense of national pride. Under Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, Japan proved that alliance doesn't mean obedience. And in doing so, it emboldened others, from Seoul to Singapore, to start questioning whether the old post-war hierarchy still made sense in a world no longer built around Washington. For Trump, the humiliation was total. His tariffs backfired, his allies rebelled, and his America First doctrine ended up isolating America most of all. The economic coercion meant to strengthen U.S. leverage became the spark that united Asia in quiet resistance. Today, as factories in Tokyo hum again, as trade corridors link Japan to Canada, India, and Southeast Asia, one message rings louder than any political slogan. The age of American economic command is over. A new order is forming, one rooted in equality, self-determination, and shared strength. And whether Washington accepts it or not, Asia is no longer waiting for permission. Because what started as one leader tearing up a deal has become something far greater, a generational shift toward independence. The camera flashes have faded, the applause long gone. But the echo of Japan's defiance still lingers, the sound of a new century beginning.